Dubari, your host, and you're watching Palla Dubari classes. In this video, we will discuss Macroeconomics Class 12. The name of the chapter that we will discuss today is the government budget. This is my third video on the topic government budget. In this video, we will discuss the deficit budget. We will discuss how many types of the budget do we have. If we have to categorize the budget, we know that we can categorize the budget into two categories. One is called the deficit budget, one is called the surplus budget, and the other one is called the balanced budget. So in this video, we will discuss each and every types of the budget. So without wasting the time period, let us start the class. Fine. Let us see how many types of the budget do we have. Types of budget. We are having three types of the budget. One is called the balanced. Second one is called surplus. And the last one is called deficit. In this video, we will emphasize more on the deficit budget. The question is, what is balance, surplus and deficit? Before going further, we should know that in the budget we are having two components. One is called the receipt and the other one is called expenditure. So how many components do we have in the budget? We are having two components, receipt and expenditure, and on the basis of these two components we categorize budget into balanced, surplus and deficit. Let us see what is the role of the receipt, expenditure to categorize the budget into three categories. Let us see what is the balanced budget. Balanced budget is that type of the budget where the receipt is equal to expenditure. The question is, what is receipt? The money which the government raised to meet out the daily expenditures or to meet out the requirement for the investment procedure or to meet out the requirement for the growth procedure is called receipt. And what is expenditure? What is receipt? The money which the government raised is called receipt. And the expenditure means the money where the government spent is called expenditure. So raising of money is called receipt and spending the money is called expenditure. So where the receipt and the expenditure is equal, that type of the budget is called the balanced budget. I hope the point is clear. Now let us see what is surplus budget. Surplus budget is that type of the budget where the receipt, the money which the government is raised is more, and the expenditure, it means that the money which the government spent is less. That is called surplus budget. I hope the point is clear. Where the money is more and the spending is less, it means where the earning is more and the expenditure is less, it is called surplus budget. Now let us see what is the deficit budget. As I told you, in this particular chapter we will discuss more on the deficit budget. Deficit budget. It is the situation where the expenditure is more and the receipt is less. Where the earning is less and where the expenditure is more, that type of the budget is called deficit budget. In our country, we always have the deficit budget. We are facing the problem of the deficit budget. Why? Because we are having the limited resources. Or it will not be wrong if I say that we are having the scarce resources, because of which we always face the problem of the deficit budget. Clear? Now let us see and discuss the budget deficit in detail. It refers to what? It refers to the excess of total budget expenditure over total receipt. When I say total budget expenditure, total receipt, what it means? It means that budget deficit is what it means? It means total expenditure exceeds the total receipt. Total expenditure means what? It means the summation of capital plus revenue expenditure. And total receipt means what? It means capital receipt plus revenue receipt. Total expenditure means what? It means capital expenditure, revenue expenditure. Total receipt means what? It means capital receipt and revenue receipt. So when the total expenditure exceeds the total receipt, that is called deficit budget. Here we can say total budget expenditure is more and the total budget receipt is less. Now let us see how we can how many types of the budgetary deficit do we have. Always remember we are having three types of budgetary deficit. How many types of the budgetary deficit do we have? We are having three types of budgetary deficit. Number one, we are having revenue deficit. Number one, we are having revenue deficit. Number two, we are having fiscal deficit. And finally, we are having primary deficit. 5 marks question can be framed from this particular topic, budgetary deficit. What is the maximum weightage of this particular topic? The maximum weightage is 5 marks. So here we have seen the type of the deficit. When I say type of the deficit, in a very simple word, we can say that the budgetary deficit can be presented by three ways. So there are three ways of presenting the budgetary deficit. One is called the revenue, fiscal and the primary deficit. Here we can say first one is revenue deficit, second one is fiscal deficit and the third one is primary deficit. We will discuss all these things in detail. Now let us discuss what is the revenue deficit. Revenue deficit is that type of the budgetary deficit where the revenue expenditure exceeds the revenue receipt. The question is what is revenue expenditure and what is revenue receipt? Revenue expenditure is that expenditure which neither increases the liabilities of the government nor decrease the assets of the government. So what is revenue expenditure? It is that type of the expenditure which is being incurred for the shorter period and it has no effect on the assets and liabilities of the government. And what are the revenue receipts? It is that type of the receipt which has no effects on the liabilities and assets as well. Or in short, we can say that we are having two sources of the revenue receipt, that is tax plus non-tax. At the time of discussing with you the components of the budget, there we have discussed the revenue receipt and the revenue expenditure. So here just always keep one thing in your mind. What is the revenue expenditure? It is that expenditure which is being incurred to meet out the daily requirements, and the money that we raised to meet out the daily expenditure is called revenue receipt. So where the daily expenditure is more and the money to meet the daily expenditure is less, it means when the revenue receipt is less and the revenue expenditure is more, that is called revenue deficit. I hope the point is clear. Now let us see and discuss the things in detail. So let us discuss the revenue deficit in detail. As we know that the government has revenue receipts in the form of tax receipt and the non-tax receipt that neither creates any liability nor reduce the assets of the government. On the other hand, the government also incur expenditure called the revenue expenditure, which does not create or reduce government liability nor create any assets of the government. When such expenditure is more and such type of the receipt is less, it is called revenue deficit. I hope the point is clear. Here we can say, what is revenue deficit? Revenue deficit is that type of the budgetary situation where the revenue expenditure is more and the revenue receipt is less. Here we can say the difference between the two is called the revenue deficit, and it is that situation where the revenue expenditure is more and the revenue receipt is less. Okay. Now let us discuss the implication of the revenue deficit. Revenue deficit indicates what it indicates? The inability of the government. It indicates that the government is incompetent to meet out the expenditure. Government has not made the planning properly, because of which the government is facing the problem of scarcity of fund. That is what the revenue deficit tells us. Second implication is, it implies dis-saving on the government account. When I say it implies dis-saving of the government account, what it means? It indicates that the saving of one sector, government is using what it's using, the saving of one sector to cover up the expenditure of the other sector, because of which both the sector cannot develop. So what it indicates, the revenue deficit indicates this saving on the government account. What it means? It means that the saving of one department will be used to meet out the expenditure of another department. Next is, it implies that the government has to, it implies, what it implies, that the government has to make up this deficit by distributing its capital budget. The revenue deficit implies that just to recover the, or just to meet out the revenue deficit, the government has to arrange the money by the sale of assets, or they have to borrow the money. When the government sell the assets or when the government borrow the money, what it means? It lead to the increase in liability, or it reduces in the assets of the government. So what is the effect of the revenue deficit that we have seen? To rectify the effect of the revenue deficit, the government is forced to borrow the money. When the government borrow the money, it increases the liability of the government. And when the government sell the assets to get the money, it result in the reduction of assets of the government. That is the implication. The next implication is, by the use of revenue capital receipt. By the use of what? By the use of capital receipt. The situation of the inflation pops up in the country, and if the government will not check the wasteful expenditure, the situation cannot be controlled. So what happened with the capital receipt? With the capital receipt, the situation of inflation will arise, and if the government will not check the wasteful expenditure, the government will not be in the position to control inflation. The next is excess borrowing. The next thing is what? The next thing is excess borrowing will increase what? It increase the burden on the repayment of loan, and it finally increases the interest payment. And with the excessive borrowing, what will happen? With the excessive borrowing, the interest will increase, yes or no? And with the increase in interest, the revenue expenditure will also increase, which widen the gap between the revenue expenditure and revenue receipt further. So that we have seen, that are the important implications of the revenue deficit. The implications can be asked in 3 marks. That's a very important topic. This implication is very important one, and this implication is also very important one. These two implications can be asked separately. I hope the point is clear. Now let us discuss the measures which the government will take to remove revenue deficit. Measures to reduce revenue deficit. Listen, the government can take two measures. Number one, the government, just to remove the, or to reduce the revenue deficit, either the government should reduce public expenditure, or the government should increase revenue. The question is how the government can reduce public expenditure. The government can reduce the public expenditure by decreasing the subsidies. Government should give less and less subsidies to the people. If the government will give less subsidies to the people, the public expenditure will decrease. This is one solution to the problem. Second is by decrease the unplanned expenditure. The government should only incur that expenditure which is according to the planning. The government should cut down or curtail the unplanned expenditure. The question is how the government can increase the revenue. How the government can increase the revenue, let us see. By imposing more tax on the people. Second is by controlling the tax evasion. By controlling what? By controlling the tax evasion. And the third one is manage the PSUs properly so that the PSU should generate more profit. So here we have seen how we can reduce the revenue deficit. We can reduce the revenue deficit by two ways. First is reduce the public expenditure and the second one is increase the revenue. What we have to do to reduce the public expenditure? By decrease the subsidy or by decrease the or curtail the non-planned expenditure. And how we can remove the or how we can increase the revenue? By imposing more taxes, by controlling the or checking the tax evasion, or manage the PSUs properly so that the PSU should generate more profit. So these are the ways by which we can reduce the revenue deficit. Now let us discuss the fiscal deficit. Always remember fiscal deficit means what? Fiscal deficit is the excess of total expenditure over total receipt excluding borrowing. Excluding what? Excluding borrowing. Fiscal deficit is clear. Let us go in detail. So in a very simple word, we can say that fiscal deficit means what? It is the excess of total expenditure over total receipt. When I say total expenditure, I am talking about the summation of capital expenditure and revenue expenditure. And here the total receipt means what? It means capital receipt plus revenue receipt excluding borrowing. Always remember fiscal deficit, it presents the more comprehensive view of the budgetary imbalances. It gives the clear picture or more clear picture of the budgetary imbalances. Why the fiscal deficit shows the more clear picture of the budgetary imbalance, not the revenue deficit? Because under the fiscal deficit, we consider total expenditure, we consider all expenditures, and we consider all receipt, which is not been found in the case of the revenue deficit. Because in the revenue deficit, we only consider revenue expenditure and revenue receipt. But in the fiscal deficit, we consider total expenditure and total receipt. So the fiscal deficit gives the more comprehensive view or more clear picture of the budgetary imbalance. It is used widely as a budgetary tool. Why? Because we get the complete information about the imbalances. It refers to the total expenditure over total receipt that we have already discussed during a given year. Fiscal deficit can be calculated by the difference between the budgetary expenditure and budgetary receipt, excluding borrowings and liabilities. Always remember the extent of the fiscal deficit. Always remember what? It means that the extent of fiscal deficit indicates what? It indicates how far the government is beyond its means. Beyond its means. In a very simple word, we can say that the fiscal deficit tells the borrowing requirement of the government. It tells us how much money the government has to borrow. Now let us discuss the implication of the fiscal deficit. The first implication of the fiscal deficit is the debt trap. The question is, what is debt trap? I'll explain this debt trap clearly to you because a short note can be asked on the debt trap. Fiscal deficit indicates what? We know that the fiscal deficit tells the requirement of the borrowing. It tells the borrowing requirement of the government. It tells us how much money the government has to borrow. Borrowing not only involves what? We are borrowing the money, the government is borrowing the money. Why? Not only to repay the principal amount, but the money is also being borrowed to repay the interest as well. So fiscal deficit indicates the total borrowing requirements of the government, and why the government has to borrow? To repay the principal amount as well as for the repayment of the interest. We know that the interest payment increase the revenue expenditure. When the interest payment increase, what will happen? When the interest payment will increase, it will increase the revenue expenditure. And with the increase in the revenue expenditure, the revenue deficit will also increase. And it creates what? It creates the vicious circle of fiscal deficit. And because of which, what will happen? We will caught in the vicious circle of fiscal deficit. When I said caught in the vicious circle of fiscal deficit, what it means? It means that the government has to borrow the money from A to pay the loan to B, and then borrow the money from C to pay the loan to B, and so on. That is called debt trap. It means that it creates the vicious circle of fiscal deficit. Clear? It means that more loan the government has to take to repay the earlier loan. And whenever the government take the loan, they take the loan from different person to repay the loan of the other person. Clear? I hope the point is clear. The next implication of the fiscal deficit is inflation. The question is, what is inflation? Inflation means increase in the price of the commodity. Government mainly borrow the money from the RBI. We have seen that when the government is in the need, they borrow the money from RBI, Reserve Bank of India. And the RBI to meet the RBI, in order to meet out the financial requirement of government through the fiscal deficit, print new currency. What the RBI do? The RBI print the new currency and give the money to the government. And printing of the new currency will increases what? It increases the circulation of money. It increases what? It increases the circulation of money. And when the circulation of the money increase, the price or the inflation will also increase. So the financial deficit also results in inflation. How? Because just to meet out the financial requirement of the government the RBI has to print the new currency, and with the printing of the new currency, the circulation increase, and with the circulation, the inflation pops up. I hope the point is clear. The next implication is growth and development get stopped. We know that whatever the money the government earns, that money the government can use for the developmental purpose, or for the repayment of loan. Or for what? Or for the repayment of loan. But because of the fiscal deficit, what the government is doing, they are using the money which they have raised for the repayment of loan, because of which what happens? The growth and the development get stopped. I hope the point is clear. Here we can say, with borrowings and the repayment, the rate of the growth falls because of the obligation of the repayment of loan, because of the responsibility to repay the money. The next is foreign dependence. When the government takes loan from the foreign government, what will happen? The foreign interference gets started in the country, as we are seeing in the case of Pakistan, as we are seeing in the case of the Sri Lanka. The Chinese involvement is keep on increasing, yes or no? So when we borrow the money from the foreign country, the dependence get increased. I hope the point is clear. Now let us discuss the next important topic, that is the primary deficit. The question is, what is primary deficit? Always remember, it is the difference between the fiscal deficit of the current year and the interest payment of last year. So what is primary deficit? Primary deficit is the difference between the fiscal deficit of the current year and the interest payment of the last year. Now let us see the implication of the primary deficit. Primary deficit is defined as the fiscal deficit minus interest payment on previous year borrowing. Therefore, it indicates what it indicates. It indicates borrowing required to meet expenses other than interest payment. What it indicate? It indicates borrowing requirement to meet out expenses other than interest payment. Find out expenses other than interest payment. Always remember, if the primary deficit is zero, it can be asked in hot questions. If the primary deficit is zero, what it means? It means that the loan is, the government has taken the money, the government has borrowed the money. Why? For the interest payment. So when the primary deficit is zero, what it means? It means that the money is being borrowed for the repayment of interest, for the payment of interest. Let us see the measures which the government can opt. The only solution to the primary deficit is that the effort should be made to reduce fiscal deficit. Second is, interest payment should be reduced as early as possible. How? By the repayment of loan, so that the primary deficit problem should be solved permanently. So what are the measures? The first measure is reduce fiscal deficit, and the second is interest payment reduce. How? By the repayment of loan. Dear viewers, that's all I have in this video. If you like the video, spread the video as much as you can so that more and more students should join the class. If you want to meet me one to one, you can fill the Google form that you find in the description. During this pandemic time period, it's appeal, stay home, stay safe, and above all, don't forget to wear mask. Om Shanti.